Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison for fighting against racial injustice. Imagine being locked away for almost 3 decades, not knowing if you would ever be free again. Most people would lose hope, but Mandela never did. He believed that even in the darkest moments, the dream of freedom must never die. His story is one of courage, sacrifice, and determination. It is the story of how one man changed not only his country but also the world. Mandela was born in a small village in South Africa in 1918. At that time, the country was deeply divided by race. White South Africans had all the power, while black South Africans had very few rights. As a child, Mandela did not fully understand this inequality, but he would soon see how unfair the world could be. He grew up listening to stories of great African leaders, warriors, and kings. These stories made him dream of a future where his people could be free. As he grew older, Mandela saw that life was different for black and white people. Black children could not attend the same schools as white children. Black families could not live in the same neighborhoods as white families. Black workers earned very little money and had no rights to protest against unfair treatment. It was a system designed to keep power in the hands of the white minority. This system was called apartheid, and it controlled every part of life in South Africa. Mandela was curious and eager to learn. He knew that education was the key to changing the future. His family supported his studies, and when he was older, he was sent to school far from home. He was the first in his family to receive a formal education. At school, he learned about history, politics, and law. He realized that laws were being used to oppress his people, and he started to dream of becoming a lawyer to fight against injustice. His journey was only beginning. The boy from a small village was about to become one of the most important leaders the world had ever seen. His path would not be easy, and the price of fighting for justice would be high. But Nelson Mandela was ready to walk the long road to freedom, no matter how difficult it would be. If you are enjoying this story and want to hear more inspiring stories while improving your English, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's continue the journey of Nelson Mandela, a man who changed history forever. Nelson Mandela was born into the Thembu royal family, part of the Xhosa people in South Africa. His father was a respected chief, and young Mandela grew up learning about the traditions of his ancestors. His childhood was filled with stories of bravery, leadership, and resistance. He listened to the elders talk about the past, when African kingdoms were strong and free. These stories planted the first seeds of ambition in his heart. He did not yet know it, but his destiny was to become a leader, not just for his people but for an entire nation. As a boy, Mandela loved to run through the fields, play with other children, and explore the natural beauty of his homeland. He learned the customs and responsibilities of his culture, understanding the importance of respect, community, and leadership. His father, however, was a man of strong principles. When he refused to obey the orders of a white magistrate, he lost his title and his land. The family was forced to move, and Mandela experienced, for the first time, how power and injustice could change lives. Despite this challenge, Mandela's mother ensured that he received a good education. He was sent to a Methodist school, where he was given the English name Nelson by his teacher. This was common at the time, as African names were often replaced by European ones in schools. Although he was now called Nelson, he never forgot his real identity and the values of his people. Mandela was a bright and disciplined student. He was deeply curious and wanted to understand the world beyond his village. When he was sent to live with the acting regent of the Thembu people, he was introduced to a new way of life. He saw leadership in action, observed important discussions, and learned about governance. He was expected to become an advisor to the king one day, following tradition. But deep inside, Mandela felt that his future would be different. He saw how black South Africans had fewer opportunities and were treated as second-class citizens. He began to question why things were this way. Why were some people free while others were not? Why did laws only benefit one group? The world outside his village seemed unfair, and he wanted to understand why. He did not yet have the answers, but he knew one thing: education was the key. The journey ahead would take him far from his childhood home. He was about to enter a world where knowledge would open doors, but also reveal the harsh reality of racial discrimination. The lessons he learned as a child would stay with him forever, guiding him through the most difficult moments of his life. Leaving his childhood home was not easy, but Nelson Mandela knew that education was the key to his future. He was sent to the prestigious Clarkberry Boarding Institute, a school for African students. It was his first time away from his family, and everything felt new and different. The classrooms, the strict routines, and the pressure to succeed made him nervous at first, but he quickly adapted. He studied hard, determined to make his family proud. He was not just learning subjects like history and English, he was learning about discipline, responsibility, and leadership. Mandela excelled in his studies and moved on to Helltown, another respected school. Here, he was introduced to the ideas of democracy, justice, and human rights. His teachers encouraged students to think beyond their daily lives, to question the world around them. It was at Helltown that he began to understand the depth of racial discrimination in South Africa. Black students were expected to obey and accept their place in society. They were taught to respect the government, but Mandela started to wonder why the government did not respect them in return. After completing high school, Mandela enrolled at the University of Fort Hare, the only university for black students in South Africa at the time. It was a place of dreams and ambition, filled with young men and women who wanted to change their futures. Mandela was excited about the possibilities ahead. He studied law and politics, eager to understand the legal system that controlled South Africa. He believed that if he knew the law, he could use it to fight for his people. University life, however, was not just about books and lectures. Fort Hare was also a place of political awakening. Many students talked about the injustices of apartheid and the need for change. Mandela became involved in student politics and was soon elected to the Student Representative Council. He was proud to be a voice for his fellow students, but when he protested against school policies, the administration expelled him. He was given a choice: apologize and return to school or leave. Mandela refused to apologize. He knew that true leadership required standing by your principles, even when it was difficult. Returning home was disappointing, but Mandela did not give up. The regent, who had raised him, wanted him to follow tradition and marry. But Mandela wanted something different. He dreamed of a life dedicated to justice, not one limited by expectations. He made a bold decision: he would leave everything behind and start a new journey in Johannesburg, the heart of South Africa. He did not know what the future held, but one thing was clear. His education had given him a new perspective on life, and he was ready to fight for what was right. Johannesburg was nothing like the villages and schools Nelson Mandela had known. It was loud, fast, and full of opportunities, but also full of deep inequality. As he walked through the city, he saw the harsh reality of apartheid. Black South Africans lived in poor areas, worked long hours for little pay, and were treated unfairly by the police and government. Meanwhile, white South Africans enjoyed the best jobs, homes, and schools. It was a system designed to keep people divided, and Mandela could no longer ignore it. To survive in the city, he took a job as a security guard at a mine. It was difficult work, but it gave him a chance to see firsthand how black workers were mistreated. They were paid less than white workers and lived in overcrowded conditions. They had no rights, no voice, and no hope for a better future. Mandela knew that something had to change. Determined to continue his education, he found a job at a law firm as a clerk while studying law at the University of Witwatersrand. He was the only black student in his class, and life was not easy. Many of his classmates looked down on him, and racism was everywhere. But he did not let it stop him. He studied harder, knowing that knowledge was his strongest weapon. During this time, Mandela met people who would change his life forever. He connected with other young activists who believed in fighting for equal rights. He also joined the African National Congress, ANC, a political organization that was working to end apartheid. At first, the ANC used peaceful protests and petitions, hoping that the government would listen. But the government did not care. Instead of bringing change, the leaders of South Africa created even stricter laws to control black citizens. Mandela saw that apartheid was not just about laws, it was about control. Black people needed passes to travel within their own country. They could not vote, own land in certain areas, or use the same public spaces as white people. If they protested, they were arrested or beaten. Families were separated, and communities were destroyed. The more Mandela learned, the more determined he became. He was no longer just a law student, he was becoming a leader in the fight for freedom. The road ahead would be dangerous. The government was not willing to give up power, and Mandela knew that challenging the system would come at a great cost. But he was ready. He had seen enough suffering, enough pain, and enough injustice. He would not stay silent. The fight against apartheid was only beginning. Nelson Mandela knew that fighting against apartheid would not be easy. The South African government had complete control, and anyone who spoke out against it was treated as a criminal. But Mandela refused to be afraid. He believed that no system of oppression could last forever. Change was possible, but only if people were willing to fight for it. As a member of the African National Congress, he worked day and night to organize protests, boycotts, and strikes. He traveled across the country, speaking to workers, students, and families, encouraging them to stand together. He believed in peaceful resistance, inspired by leaders like Mahatma Gandhi. If enough people refused to follow unjust laws, the government would have to listen. But the government did not listen. Instead, it responded with violence. Police used force to break up protests, arresting and beating demonstrators. Black South Africans were treated as enemies in their own country. Every step forward seemed to bring even greater obstacles, but Mandela refused to give up. His speeches became more powerful, and his influence grew. People started to see him as a leader, a symbol of hope. His words inspired thousands. I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter, I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. As Mandela and the ANC continued their efforts, the government became more aggressive. Laws were passed to silence activists, and protests were declared illegal. The police targeted Mandela, monitoring his every move. He was arrested multiple times and warned to stop his activities. But he refused to be silent. He knew that real change required sacrifice. More and more, he began to realize that peaceful resistance alone might not be enough. The government was willing to use force to maintain apartheid, and Mandela was beginning to question if nonviolence was the only path forward. The struggle for freedom was reaching a turning point, and Mandela was prepared to face whatever came next. Nelson Mandela had spent years fighting against apartheid, but the South African government saw him as a dangerous man. He was not a criminal, but to those in power, he was a threat. His speeches, protests, and growing influence made the government afraid. They knew that if more people followed him, the system of apartheid would not survive. They needed to stop him. In 1961, after years of peaceful protests that were met with violence, Mandela and other leaders of the African National Congress decided to take a new approach. They created a group called Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation. This group would not attack people, but it would sabotage government buildings and infrastructure to weaken the apartheid system. Mandela did not believe in violence, but he believed that every other method had failed. He had tried to change the system through peace, but the government had answered with brutality. Now, he felt he had no choice but to fight back in a stronger way. As the leader of this movement, Mandela became the most wanted man in South Africa. He changed locations constantly, disguised himself to avoid being recognized, and moved in secret. The media called him the Black Pimpernel because he was always one step ahead of the police. He traveled to other African countries and even to Europe, gathering support and training. But in 1962, his luck ran out. He was captured by the police and put on trial for inciting strikes and leaving the country illegally. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but his fight was far from over. While Mandela was in prison, the government continued its crackdown on the anti-apartheid movement. Many of his fellow activists were arrested, and in 1964, Mandela was put on trial again, this time for sabotage and conspiracy against the government. He faced the death penalty. Instead of begging for mercy, he used the trial as an opportunity to speak. He stood in court and delivered one of the most powerful speeches in history. I have walked a long road to freedom. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. His words shook the world. People across the globe protested for his release. But the South African government was determined to silence him. Instead of executing him, they sentenced him to life in prison. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a harsh prison off the coast of Cape Town. It was a place of isolation, hard labor, and suffering. But even in prison, he remained strong. He refused to be broken. He continued to fight, even from behind bars. His imprisonment was meant to end his influence, but instead, it made him a legend. The world did not forget him. He was locked away on Robben Island, but his spirit remained unbroken. The prison was designed to break men, both physically and mentally. Prisoners were forced to work under the hot sun in a limestone quarry, their hands blistered and their backs aching. The guards treated them harshly, giving them little food and no comfort. Letters from family were censored, and visits were rare. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. But Mandela refused to lose hope. He found ways to continue his fight, even behind bars. He and other political prisoners turned Robben Island into a place of learning. They taught each other history, politics, and philosophy, calling their secret discussions the Robben Island University. Mandela believed that knowledge was power, and even in prison, he encouraged others to think, to learn, and to prepare for the day when they would be free. News of Mandela's imprisonment spread across the world. Activists, leaders, and ordinary people began to demand his release. Protests erupted in different countries. Musicians wrote songs about him. Nations imposed sanctions on South Africa, pressuring the government to end apartheid. The name Nelson Mandela was now a symbol of justice, not just in South Africa, but around the world. Inside the prison, he never allowed himself to feel hate. Even towards the guards who insulted him, he remained calm. Over time, some of them began to respect him. They saw that he was not a criminal, he was a man fighting for freedom. He was patient, waiting for the right moment, knowing that change would come. After 18 years on Robben Island, Mandela was moved to Pollsmoor Prison and later to Victor Verster Prison. The conditions were better, but he was still not free. However, the world outside was changing. The protests against apartheid were growing stronger. South Africa was under immense pressure to reform. The government knew that keeping Mandela in prison was no longer possible. Then, in 1989, a turning point arrived. South African President P.W. Botha resigned, and his successor, F.W. de Klerk, saw that apartheid could not last. He began negotiations to end racial segregation and knew that Mandela was the key to peace. After 27 years in prison, the moment of freedom was near. The world held its breath. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison after 27 years. The world watched as he took slow, steady steps, holding the hand of his wife, Winnie Mandela. Thousands of people cheered in the streets, waving banners and singing songs of freedom. News cameras captured the historic moment, and millions around the world saw the face of the man who had become a symbol of justice. He was no longer just a prisoner, he was the leader of a movement that could not be stopped. Mandela did not leave prison with anger. He did not call for revenge. Instead, he spoke of peace. He knew that South Africa could not survive if its people remained divided. Many black South Africans wanted to fight back against years of oppression, but Mandela urged them to choose a different path. He believed that true victory would come not through violence, but through unity. His first speech as a free man was powerful. He reminded his people that their struggle was not over. The laws of apartheid still existed, and the fight for democracy was just beginning. But he also called for reconciliation, for people of all races to come together to build a new nation. Some were skeptical. Could black and white South Africans truly live as equals after so much pain? Mandela believed they could. The road ahead was not easy. There were still those who resisted change, who wanted to keep the old system in place. Some white South Africans feared losing power, while some black South Africans wanted immediate justice. Violence erupted in different parts of the country. Mandela worked tirelessly, traveling from town to town, meeting with leaders, speaking to the people, calming tensions. His goal was clear: South Africa needed a peaceful transition to democracy. His leadership during this time showed the world the kind of man he was. He was not just fighting for political change, he was fighting for a nation where people could look past their differences and see each other as human beings. He had spent 27 years behind bars, but he never lost sight of his dream. He had walked a long road to freedom, and now, he was closer than ever to seeing it become reality. In 1993, Mandela and F.W. de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to end apartheid peacefully. It was recognition of the incredible progress that had been made. 1 year later, South Africa prepared for something that had never happened before: its first democratic elections, where people of all races could vote. The world watched as history was about to be written. April 27, 1994, was a day that South Africa would never forget. For the first time in history, black South Africans were allowed to vote in a national election. Millions of people stood in long lines, waiting for hours to cast their ballots. Some were elderly, voting for the first time in their lives. Others walked miles just to have the chance to make their voices heard. The excitement, hope, and emotion filled the air. This was not just an election, it was the birth of a new nation. When the results were announced, it was no surprise. Nelson Mandela had won by a landslide. The people had chosen him as their leader, as the man who would guide South Africa into a new era. On May 10, 1994, he was sworn in as the country's first black president. The ceremony was attended by world leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens who had fought for this moment. Standing before them, Mandela delivered a speech that echoed across the world. He spoke of unity, forgiveness, and the need to build a nation where all South Africans, black and white, could live together in peace. Many feared that the years of injustice and suffering would lead to revenge, but Mandela had a different vision. He believed that South Africa's future depended on reconciliation, not hatred. He worked to bring former enemies together, inviting white leaders to be part of his government and creating policies that promoted equality. One of his most famous efforts was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which allowed victims and perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes to tell their stories. Instead of seeking punishment, the goal was to heal the wounds of the past and move forward as one nation. Mandela also focused on rebuilding South Africa's economy and providing education and opportunities for those who had been oppressed for decades. He knew that political freedom alone was not enough. People needed jobs, homes, and a better quality of life. His leadership was not perfect, and challenges remained, but his presence gave the country hope. South Africa was changing, and the world watched in admiration. One of the most powerful symbols of this change came in 1995 during the Rugby World Cup. Rugby had long been seen as a sport for white South Africans, and the national team, the Springboks, was a symbol of the old regime. But Mandela saw an opportunity. Instead of rejecting the team, he embraced it. He encouraged black South Africans to support the Springboks, showing that sports could unite the nation. When South Africa won the championship, Mandela walked onto the field wearing the team's jersey, shaking hands with the captain. The crowd erupted in cheers. It was a moment of true unity, proving that reconciliation was possible. Mandela had achieved what many thought was impossible. He had turned a country divided by hate into a country with hope. He had spent 27 years in prison, yet he chose forgiveness over revenge. He had fought for justice, but he also fought for peace. His journey as president would only last 5 years, but his impact would last forever. After serving one term as president, Nelson Mandela made a decision that surprised many. He stepped down. Unlike other leaders who held on to power for as long as possible, Mandela believed that true democracy meant allowing new leaders to take his place. In 1999, he peacefully handed over power to his successor, showing the world that South Africa was now a country governed by its people, not by a single leader. Even after leaving office, his work was far from over. Mandela dedicated the rest of his life to humanitarian efforts, fighting for human rights, education, and the fight against poverty. He established the Nelson Mandela Foundation, which focused on social justice and helping communities in need. He traveled the world, meeting with global leaders, inspiring young people, and continuing to spread his message of peace and equality. He became a symbol of hope not just for South Africa, but for people everywhere. Despite his fame, Mandela remained humble. He never saw himself as a hero, always reminding people that he was just one man in a long struggle for justice. He believed in the power of ordinary people to create change. He once said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." These words became a guiding light for activists, students, and dreamers around the world. As he grew older, his health declined, and he made fewer public appearances. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. The world mourned his loss, but his legacy remained stronger than ever. Leaders from every continent attended his funeral, paying tribute to a man who had taught the world the true meaning of forgiveness, leadership, and perseverance. Today, Nelson Mandela's name is spoken with respect and admiration. His face appears on South African currency. His birthday, July 18, is celebrated as Nelson Mandela International Day, encouraging people to do good deeds in his honor. His life serves as a reminder that no matter how difficult the struggle, change is possible. His journey from a small village boy to a global icon proves that one person, armed with courage and determination, can transform the world. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and comment. What inspired you most about Nelson Mandela? Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories and to improve your English. And remember, do not judge me by my successes, judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again. Do you want to improve your English 20x faster? Whether it's grammar, conversation, or fluency, we have the perfect material for you. Click the link in the description or the first pinned comment and take your English to the next level.